I'd just like to express huge sympathy with Peter for that little piece of work, because we dealt, when we were doing a stem cell transplant of the trachea last year, with a 3-month process of dealing with the regulatory authorities, which is a complete nightmare. Okay, this is going to work now. Good. So my brief today is to talk about making surgery safe and some lessons from pediatric cardiac surgery. Now, what I've tried to do is to simplify and take us down from the level of complexity we've heard about this morning. And just to remind you that surgery is inherently not safe. I'm not sure if any of you have seen this before, but surgery is about as safe as bungee jumping compared with high reliability organizations. And that this is not the fate of the disease, this is the mistakes that we make. My own field of pediatric cardiac surgery is very complicated. It's complicated not just because of the disease, not because of what we do to the child, but because of the complexity of the kit that's associated and the large number of people with whom we interact. There is massive potential for error. And yet, despite that, if you look at the mortality for the specialty over the last 60 or so years, it's fallen from almost 100% in the late 40s down to 1.4% in my unit last year. When I joined, all the headlines in the paper were "hole in the heart, baby lives." That's the opposite now. The headlines are when a hole in the heart baby dies. The culture of the life in which we work has changed, and the personality of the people within it has also had to alter. And what changed, what was seminal for many of us, was Bristol.
This horrific tragedy has sent nothing short of an earthquake through British medicine, and the reverberations are likely to be felt for years.
That was from the Panorama program that came out just after the Bristol crisis, where, if you remember, a large number of children died, and it was felt to be due to a whole bunch of reasons associated with the way that Bristol was organized and the, quote, arrogance and lack of insight of the surgeons. Those surgeons, James Wishart at the top left, Janardhan Dasmana on the right, and the medical director, Roylance, were struck off, and an appeal was denied. And Frank Dobson ordered the Kennedy inquiry, the GMC launched guidelines in clinical governance, and the BMJ editorial at the time said all is changed, and changed utterly. Sadly, we haven't failed to learn an enormous number of lessons. This is a recognizable view of most surgeons, I suspect. There were 196 recommendations at the end of the Kennedy inquiry. If you read through those, and I won't read them out for you, you'll recognize that they have reappeared in the mid-staffs inquiry 13 years later. That's a terrible indictment of us as a specialty. What we did do quite well in cardiac surgery compared with other specialties right from the beginning was publish what we did. And when we published it, it was a voluntary registry comparing centers' mortality outcomes. It was a varying accuracy of reporting, sadly, no risk stratification, and only based on the procedure. Publishing those data and the Bristol inquiry meant that people suddenly, the public suddenly had to get to grips with results. And this is what they think. When you're faced with a lack of understanding about even the most simple parts of statistics from our politicians, there is a vulnerability in the way in which we work. Now, we've gone on in cardiac surgery to publish our data by center for every condition that we treat. The data mortality are now linked to the Office of National Statistics, and these are the most accurate mortality figures for cardiac surgery in the world. And they're published now and will be published by name of surgeon very shortly. And this is Congenital Cardiac Audit Database. But there's a law of unintended consequences. You'll all have heard of safe and sustainable, and our desire to reduce the number of centers in cardiac surgery to improve quality. Just at the end of that process, which some people in the audience are particularly associated with, something happened, which was that Roger Boyle, the very, very successful cardiac czar, who was pretty well single-handedly managed to get a reduction in mortality for cardiac disease and associated with that with stroke, saw some new data which he gave to Bruce Keogh and then announced in public that he wouldn't send his daughter to Leeds. The new data were also developed from improving the risk stratification and the quality of the results that we provide by introducing variable life-adjusted displays, which are shown here, and where you allow for the risk by, on this plot, when somebody dies, if it's a high-risk death, they have a small vertical fall. If it's a low-risk death, they have a large vertical fall. And you really want to be above the line and not below the line. This is the observed versus expected mortality. The Leeds data showed that they were 3 times the expected mortality on the first draft. But as you can see at the bottom there, more than a third of their data had not been submitted for weight, which was one of the variables in the model. When that was readjusted, they were within the confidence intervals and therefore safe by this measure. And Bruce Keogh had to backtrack in public. Now, and Roger Boyle has resigned or retired. What it shows is the importance of getting your data right. It doesn't argue against making your data public. And so the first set of lessons that I want to put up are that iterate improvement works. There have only been 2 randomized trials in pediatric cardiac surgery to get the mortality down to 1.4%. Both of those resulted in equipoise. Quality control is good. Transparency is necessary because I'm a parent and I want to know what my child can expect. Competition between centers is inevitable, and you have to be very, very careful what you say in public and time it well. But it's not about us. Safety is not about us. It's all about the patient. And I want to move on to talk about how we can avoid adverse outcomes and use some of the lessons from pediatric cardiac surgery, which we've used in our own center and in others, to try and convert these into 10 rules that anybody in any practice can follow. And the first is to go back and think about the complex interrelationships which we have as surgeons. In the middle sit you as a surgeon. You have your own physical attributes, a certain amount of knowledge. You come with attitudes. You come from different cultures, and you behave differently when you're stressed. You have to interact with others who have the same problems and generate teamwork and communication and so on. Each of you is living in a political climate. Imagine what it must feel like in Leeds at the moment, for example. We all know how it feels to be in the middle of an NHS change. You have to interact with hardware and technology, as we've heard this morning. And there's a whole bunch of stuff which we're supposed to know, which sits in an office somewhere, which we can't remember and don't have instantaneous intellectual access to. Every one of those interactions can fail. And that puts us in the bungee jumping level. Now, if I take my child into hospital to be looked after by one of you, this is my rule. I don't want my child to be harmed by you. Hippocrates said that at the beginning. Nothing much has changed since then. So the first rule on my 10 Commandments is adverse events are important. And they're important because they're built on the core values on which we all work as physicians. Those values are the basis of what we do, and indeed, who we are as human beings. It's why we get up in the morning. Aridazi drew out these 3 core values for healthcare: safety for the patient, a good experience for the patient, and the ability to demonstrate effective clinical outcomes. But I'm going to add 2 to those. The first is, you must tell the truth. I cannot bear it when doctors I work with don't tell me the truth. And if I interact with a health service as a patient and the doctor isn't telling me the truth, including I don't know, I'm very uncomfortable. If they tell the truth, then I trust them. And I don't think that makes any difference for a parent. So rule 2, which comes courtesy of James Reason, who's an organizational psychologist from Manchester, is that human error is inevitable. We all make mistakes. I challenge anybody in this room to put their hand up if they have never made a mistake in the operating room. Done. Remember that 60 to 70% of an average NHS trust turnover goes on staff. Therefore, you can multiply the number of errors by the number of interactions between that number of people. If you know that human error is inevitable, then it makes sense to anticipate that there are going to be adverse outcomes. And you need to prepare for the worst. That's what my mother used to tell me. Prepare for the worst, it tends not to happen. And even if it does, have a get-out strategy. I'm sure you've all worked with people who do fantastic operations, but they only know who to do that operation. They haven't worked out what to do if it goes wrong. Now, we've had the privilege of working with McLaren and Ferrari and the Red Bull, most recently the Red Bull team, to look at a whole number of aspects of safety. And I'm very grateful to Christian Horner for lending me this clip, which is Mark Webber colliding with the back of a car at 200 miles an hour and then landing on his head, spinning over, colliding with a wall at a closing speed of just under 160 miles an hour, head on. 20 minutes later, he was drinking, without a tremor, an espresso. That's a quite remarkable thing. And what's happened in Formula One is that although it's dangerous, they have made it safe by putting safety absolutely at the front of what they do. They want to win, but they want it to be safe. The closing impact on his head was 16 G, which would normally be fatal. But because of excellent design from Sid Watkins of the kit in the cockpit, his actual impact of his head was less than 4 G, so he survived. It doesn't look so good if you sit where he is. It must hurt your head. When we worked with Formula One, which was largely about making handovers safe, and I'll show you that in a minute, we learnt a number of tricks. Firstly, never have meetings around square tables. When you have meetings around square tables, somebody takes the lead, and what you want to get the most effective rules in safety are to work together, cooperatively, with no dominance. Everybody has a view. And the second is to spend a lot of time rehearsing what you're going to do. The second rule, rehearse what you're going to do. And guess what the third rule is? Rehearse what you're going to do. In all my life in surgery, that doesn't happen. Well, that's not true. It does in some. I can convert it to another case where I might want to rephrase this as anticipate, prepare, and practice. If you do a pit stop, as we learned to do pit stops with Ferrari, you do them over and over again, practicing what could go wrong, not anticipating what could go right. In medicine, we're really good at looking backwards and very bad at looking forwards and working it through together with the people we work with. And indeed, the people we work with is highly relevant because we now are working in a different model of professionalism. Certainly in pediatrics, and I imagine in most of your world, when I see a family and a child in my office or before a surgery, they know as much as I do. They can work Google. When they click on Google, they find my name. When they find my name, they find my publications. Then they're in PubMed. When they're in PubMed, they can read the paper. And when they read the paper, they can work out backwards what they need to know. And on YouTube, they can watch the operation they're going to have. They are sharing the knowledge we have. No longer is the doctor the person with the leather patches sitting in general practice knowing everything. They know as much as we do. We have to provide insight. We work in teams. We don't work on our own. So when we plan what we want to do, it's no good doing it alone. And I have worked over the years and seen surgeons who have a really good internal model of what's going to happen and a hopeless mode of communicating it with the people that they work with. That is prone to error. So once you've made your plan, you have to communicate with everyone who might need it. And interactions with healthcare in communication are notoriously difficult, as I hope this will show you.
Hello and welcome to the Mental Health Hotline. If you are obsessive-compulsive, press 1 repeatedly. If you are codependent, ask someone to press 2 for you. If you have multiple personalities, press 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you are paranoid, we know what you are and what you want. Stay on the line and we'll trace your call. If you're delusional, press 7 and your call will be transferred to the mothership. If you are schizophrenic, listen carefully and a small voice will tell you which number to press. If you are depressive, it doesn't matter which number you press, no one will answer you. If you are dyslexic, press 69696969. If you have a nervous disorder, please fidget with the hash key until the beep. After the beep, please wait for the beep. If you have a short-term memory loss, please try your call again later. And if you have low self-esteem, hang up. All our operators are too busy to talk to you.
On the whole, that's what it feels like for a customer to deal with us. We speak another language, we don't really care what they want to say, we put barriers in their way. And that's true of everybody from the patient through to the nurses and the technicians with whom we work. Communication came up very heavily in the Bristol inquiry. And one of the most dangerous parts of the process was the journey after a complicated cardiac operation to the intensive care unit. There were so many near misses as a result of that journey because you have one tired team wanting to pass a child over to one team that would rather be in the pub as well. By working with Formula One on the pit stop basis, we managed to have a 4-time reduction in multiple errors by making a proper process of handover, by making it safe, by learning from other industries and recognizing that safety is more important than the pride of ownership. The last person to speak in this whole setup is the surgeon. Rule 6, respect the patient. Now, I showed you this little clip before, but respect the patient is really important because remember, it's a person you're treating and somebody loves them. When I started training in medicine, I was told to distance myself from emotion, to be cool because you won't be able to cope. What a load of bollocks. And a good example of that comes to me from the Beth Israel Hospital, where they had a terrible Never event, and their chief executive introduced something which I suspect we couldn't do for its name reason in the UK, but this was the moment of reverence. When you've got that patient wrapped on the operating table, covered over with drapes, take time out after the briefing, after the checklist, and remember that someone's little girl on the table, a person who's on loan to you to be cared for. You have no right to harm her or to take unnecessary or unagreed risks. And I'm not going to tell the story that this lady tells, again, because I haven't got time, but I really urge you to write that down, go to the Risky Business website and watch her speak about what happened to her child. She stood in front of an audience and said those words, "You have no right to harm her and no right to take unnecessary or unagreed risks." Her child died because somebody tried a piece of equipment for which they weren't trained. Check. Everything you're doing is okay. This is what you need to do to get a 747 off the ground. If any of those things aren't ticked, you stay on the ground, no matter who you are. It's short and succinct, and it works. And you'll all know or heard of Atul Gawande, who I had the pleasure to have dinner with last week. He, introducing checklists across the world, reduced infection, death, and complications. And I think probably single-handedly has resulted in more lives being saved around the world than maybe anybody else in this room. A quite remarkable achievement, all on the back of the checklist. Do it once and do it right, and don't take shortcuts. We were just having a conversation before we started about the importance of not just planning what you want to do, but doing it at a pace which makes sure that you do what you're doing correctly. Don't rush, don't take shortcuts. The next lesson we learnt comes from working with the red arrows. And a lot of those other things are up there, and I've talked a little bit about briefing, which is very important. But what we have singularly failed to introduce is debriefing, which is discussing what we did as a team at the end of the day. I still can't get that off the ground. But they would never do a display without debriefing, even before they meet the Queen. And what they do is do everything under video observation, absolutely everything. Every one of us in this room, I think, should be fighting to introduce video and audio records of everything we do in the operating room, because it's our duty to the next child, the next patient, to analyze the mistakes we make and be able to review them and learn from them. And the biggest obstacle to introducing that anywhere has been the attitude of surgeons. We care more about ourselves in many respects than we do about the patients we treat. And we have to overcome that. It's not about fear, it's not about legislation, litigation, it's about protecting our next patient. So debriefing and learning as soon as possible are critical. My final rule is to measure and share and improve. We've heard a lot about the ability to use metrics to monitor performance, but I'd say quality control in the work that we do in our own individual practices is what will make things better for all of us. Data, I'm completely obsessional about where we work, and data drive change. If you don't have any information, you can't change people's minds. They won't follow it. A good example of the principle of continuous improvement came from Steve Hansen, the All Blacks coach, in December, when he said, "Don't ask how good we are, just be sure that we're going to get better." I'm very pleased to say we beat them the next day, but that's not quite the same thing. I am absolutely sure they'll come back and thrash us next year, because they won't let that happen. And we use a lot of these statistical process control charts, quality control methodology, to see exactly how we do. And this is, I just looked at the checklist to see how we've introduced the checklist at Great Ormond Street over a 2-year period. And these are the processes that have changed at each time. Each green line is a statistically significant change, and now we have 100% compliance in every procedure we do with the utilization of the checklist. Doctors are competitive with each other, and they don't want to get left behind. If you put the data up in front of them, they get better. And here's another example. We didn't know what the cardiac surgical infection rate was. We photograph the wounds at home when the patients have gone home with an iPhone. If it's red, it's an infection. Very sensitive indicator. And just by putting the data up at the end of the year in front of the team, the following year, the incidence went down with no management, just natural, innate medical competitiveness. The same for post-operative bleeding. Just people tightened up their behavior because we put the results up every day. These are Q-sum charts, which you'll all be familiar with. And Q-sum charts are a very, very simple way of mapping what you do. Every part of our process is monitored and presented in this way and live on our intranet site. Next year, I'm going to put them live on the internet for our patients to see. So these are those rules listed in 10. They've come in pediatric cardiac surgery from learning from mistakes that we've made, from other industries, and with an absolute commitment that we're there for the next patient, not just the one we're treating. I'll leave you with a culture-changing question for me, which I ask myself every day. Would this quality of care be acceptable to me or to my family? And if it isn't, I have to do something about it, and so does everybody who comes across that problem. Thank you very much.